He was just a poor farm boy carrying buckets of water in the fields, but the pattern he discovered would one day save NASA and nearly got him arrested. Morning on the southern plains of America began as it always did, with the sound of buckets scraping over dry soil and the splash of water poured into wooden troughs. The land was cracked and thirsty, grass grew thin, and every drop of water mattered. For most, this was simply the rhythm of survival, the sound of poverty repeating itself day after day. But for James, a thin, dark-skinned boy of 13, the rhythm meant something else. James carried water before the sun was fully risen, his shoulders straining under the weight of buckets nearly half his size. His shirt clung with sweat, his shoes worn down to the soles. As he walked, the water inside the buckets trembled and spilled. Droplets struck the earth. Plop, plop, plop. At first he cursed the waste. It took so much effort to draw water from the stubborn well. But soon, without knowing why, James began to count. 1, 2, 3. Then again, 1, 2, 3. The rhythm was steady. The numbers arranged themselves inside his mind like beads on a string. At midday, when his father lay under the oak tree to rest, James stayed awake. He took a stick and drew numbers in the dirt. 1, 3, 5, 7. The figures looked simple, but to him they carried mystery. He did not know the words arithmetic progression. He only felt the order, sensed that something in the world whispered through these numbers, binding even water and time together. In the evenings, when the cattle pressed their noses to the troughs, James began a private experiment. Instead of pouring the water all at once, he ladled it carefully, giving a little here, a little there, measuring with his eyes. To his surprise, the cattle drank calmly, none left thirsty, none left with too much. He had found a balance, a way of dividing so that nothing was wasted. A thought startled him. If water could be shared without loss, what else could be divided this way? That night, while his family slept, James sat by the dim light of an oil lantern. The boards of the barn became his chalkboard. From his pocket he pulled a piece of chalk left over from school. On the rough wood he wrote clumsy symbols, numbers scattered in crooked rows. To anyone else it was nonsense. To James it was a hidden language. He wrote, "If there are R buckets of water and N cattle and each must receive X, then X1 plus X2 plus XNER. He had no idea this was an equation. No teacher had explained such things. He only knew it was true, and it filled him with quiet wonder. Could this idea stretch beyond the barn? Could this rule feed not only cattle but solve problems he could not yet imagine? Sometimes his father discovered the chalk marks on the barn wall. "James," he said sternly, "numbers will not put bread on this table. Work, not scribbles, keeps us alive." James lowered his head, but inside he resisted. He could not ignore the calling of those patterns. When night fell again, he returned to the wall and wrote more, tracing lines with determination. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the horizon, James sat outside listening to the cattle chew slowly, their shadows long across the dirt. From the window drifted the crackling of the old family radio. Its voice carried news from far beyond their fields, voices from places James could hardly imagine. That night, the radio spoke of rockets, of NASA, of the dream to leave Earth for the heavens. James's eyes widened. He had heard the name NASA before, spoken like a spell of wonder, a world unreachable. But when the voice spoke of fuel problems, of engines that burned too fast or too unevenly, his heart leapt. Fuel, he thought, like water. Rockets, like cattle, must be fed in the right measure. The connection sent a tremor through him. Could his little law of buckets and troughs reach into the sky? The idea seemed impossible, laughable even. But the whisper stayed with him. That night James could not sleep. Lying on his narrow cot, sharing space with his younger brother, he stared at the cracked ceiling. In his ears he still heard the rhythm, plop, plop, plop. Each drop a number, each number a promise. Poverty had hidden the secret inside his daily labor. It was up to him to see it. His father, weary from the fields, did not notice the fierce light in James's eyes. His mother, bent by chores, never guessed that her son was building bridges between chores and the cosmos. But James knew. Numbers were not distant things from books. They were living here in the farm, in each drop of water, each aching step. He believed that if he could learn their secrets, he might change something, not just for himself, but for a world that never looked toward boys like him. That night, with the lantern sputtering, James pressed the last stub of chalk against the barn wall. His fingers grew white with dust as he drew arrows, boxes, strange shapes no one else would understand. He leaned back and whispered to the dark, "There is a rule here, even in this place. I will find it." He did not know his vow would carry him far beyond fences and fields. He did not know men in pressed shirts would one day gather to watch him draw on shining boards. He could not imagine suspicion, near arrest, and sudden recognition. For now, he knew only the sound of drops falling steady as a clock, steady as destiny. And so James's story began, not in universities or laboratories, but on a farm where poverty pressed hard, with nothing more than buckets of water and the quiet brilliance of a boy who saw numbers where others saw only labor. It was a beginning no one else would have believed, except James himself. The nights on the farm were often silent, save for the hum of insects and the creak of old wood shifting in the cool air. For James, that silence was not emptiness, but invitation. It was in those hours, when his father's snores carried from the house and the fields lay still, that James dared to let his mind roam beyond chores and cattle. He would slip outside with the chalk stub hidden in his pocket. The barn wall, rough and stained by years of weather, had become his secret slate. Here, the boy's hand moved slowly at first, tracing the simple rows of numbers he had counted in the rhythm of water drops. 1, 3, 5, 7, 2, 4, 6, 8. But soon, the numbers gathered into something greater. James began to stack them, to connect them with lines, to search for a deeper sense. He whispered aloud, almost afraid of his own thoughts. If I have our buckets of water, and each cow needs some, then I must choose how much to give each one. If I do it wrong, one cow will go thirsty, and another will spill what it cannot drink. He paused, stared at the chalk marks. He did not know that mathematicians far away called this allocation. He only knew that in his world, waste was sin, and scarcity was suffering. Numbers, therefore, were not games. They were tools for survival. He tried again. Let x1 be the water for the first cow, x2 for the second, and so on. If there are n cows, then x1 plus x2 plus z plus xn must equal r. The chalk squeaked against the wood. He frowned, as though waiting for the wall itself to answer back. Then he added more. If I want to carry less, I must choose in such a way that my walking is smaller. Which means I must minimize the work. He had no symbol for minimize, so he drew a crooked arrow pointing downward, next to the words, less work. He grinned. In his own language, the problem was captured. The next evening, James tested his idea. He filled his buckets half as much, walked back and forth more often, but poured the water in careful shares. The cattle drank peacefully. He studied their movements, their snorts, their tails swishing in the dusk. None pressed against another. None cried out in thirst. For the first time, James felt as though he were not merely a boy with chores but a conductor of balance, arranging animals and water as though they were parts of a larger song. Later, when the sky filled with stars, he returned to his wall. He wrote the words, "Equal sharing makes peace." Beneath it, he scrawled the numbers again, more confident this time. His younger brother once caught him and asked, "Why do you keep writing those funny things, James?" James smiled faintly. "Because the drops tell me stories. If I listen right, I can hear what they mean." The little one only shrugged, not understanding. But James pressed on, speaking as if to himself. "Every drop has a place. If I can learn where each belongs, then nothing is wasted." There was something holy in this discovery. Poverty had taught James that nothing could be lost, not food, not time, not even hope. And now numbers confirmed the same law. If life could be divided properly, it might be enough for all. One Sunday afternoon, while his father mended a fence and his mother baked bread in the hot kitchen, James sat on the porch with his chalkboard of wood. He drew boxes to represent cattle, arrows to represent water, and tiny numbers beneath. He arranged and rearranged them, muttering under his breath. To a stranger, it would have seemed like a child's play. But James felt as though he were speaking to the universe. He remembered the radio broadcast. NASA struggling with fuel. Rockets needed fuel in perfect balance, or else they failed. What if his small trick could stretch that far? He dared not tell his father such thoughts. The man would only laugh or grow angry. Still, James let the dream take root. He imagined giant rockets as thirsty cattle, and fuel as the buckets of water he carried each day. One evening, after finishing his chores, James tried something bold. He scratched a set of numbers on the barn wall, larger than before. X1 plus X2 plus X3 plus XN equal R. Beneath it, he wrote, "Make the cost as small as possible." His handwriting was clumsy, the chalk nearly gone, but in those marks lay a principle older than himself, older even than the farm. Without knowing, James had stepped into the world of optimization, the science of making the best choice under limits. He stared at his work until the lantern sputtered. Then he whispered, "This is the pattern. I can see it now." The days passed, and James carried water as always, but the chore no longer felt the same. Each trip to the well was an experiment. Each drop was evidence. He began timing how long it took him to walk, how much weight he could bear, and how quickly each cow finished drinking. He wrote numbers secretly in a tattered notebook, the paper smudged with dirt and sweat. At night he reviewed his notes like treasures. He saw relationships forming, patterns tightening. He began to think not only of cattle, but of people, of whole towns. If food could be shared this way, none would starve, he told himself. If medicine could be given this way, none would suffer. One evening his father found the chalk marks again and shook his head. "James," he said, voice tired, "the world does not run on dreams. It runs on sweat. These numbers won't keep the farm alive." James wanted to answer, but he stayed silent. How could he explain that the numbers were not escape, but hope? That inside them he saw not only survival, but freedom. Instead, he bowed his head and waited for nightfall. When the house grew dark, James crept out once more. The wall bore layer upon layer of numbers, faded and smudged, but he added to them anyway. He no longer feared the roughness of the wood or the weakness of his chalk. He knew the pattern was real. He placed his hand flat against the wall, as if to steady himself. His eyes shone in the dim light. "One day," he whispered, "someone will see. They will understand that even a boy carrying water can hear the pattern in the drops." And with that, James returned to his cot, his body weary, but his mind alive with fire. The pattern had revealed itself. It was no longer just water, or cattle, or chalk. It was a law that might reach as far as rockets in the sky. And though James did not yet know how, he felt certain that his life had been joined to something vast, a current of truth flowing far beyond the fences of the farm. The radio in James's house was old and battered, a box of wood and wires that seemed always on the verge of silence. Yet it remained the family's only window to the world beyond the farm. Most nights it crackled with hymns, weather reports, or the stern voices of men speaking about politics. To James, it was like listening to a river flowing past, a river he could see but never touch. One evening, as the cicadas screamed in the dark and the smell of cornbread drifted from the kitchen, James sat by the radio. His father leaned back in his chair, half asleep, while his mother sewed quietly nearby. James's younger brother played with a piece of string on the floor. The announcer's voice came through the static, sharp and urgent. NASA engineers are facing serious challenges in the management of fuel distribution for the Apollo project. Recent tests have shown instability in the way fuel is being fed into the rocket's engines, threatening both efficiency and safety. James's eyes widened. His breath caught. Fuel distribution. Engines failing because the fuel did not flow evenly. His mind leapt at once to the troughs, the buckets, the chalk marks on the barn wall. It's the same problem, he thought, his heart hammering. It's the same pattern. Too much to one engine, too little to another, and the rocket will stumble just like cattle fighting for water. He leaned closer, almost pressing his ear against the radio's dusty grill. The announcer went on about flow dynamics, pressure stability, and optimization under constraints. James did not know these words, not in their polished form, but the meaning, the heart of it, was already alive inside him. They need to divide fuel the way I divide water. He closed his eyes and saw the numbers on his barn wall. R units, N engines, each engine needing its share, X1 plus X2 plus Xn equals R. Balance meant survival. Uneven sharing meant disaster. The announcer's voice faded into another topic, but James remained frozen in his chair. The room around him blurred. The ticking clock, the dim lantern, the hum of night insects. He was no longer in a farmhouse in the south. In his mind, he stood before a massive rocket gleaming under floodlights, fuel tanks towering, engineers wringing their hands. He could almost hear them whispering the same frustration he had whispered at the trough. How do we share this so nothing is wasted and nothing is lacking? He whispered aloud, too quietly for his family to hear. I know how. His father stirred in his chair. Turn that thing down, James. Ain't nothing in there for us. James obeyed, lowering the volume. But the fire inside him burned too strong to be quieted. As soon as his chores were done the next day, he raced to the barn, his pockets full of scraps of paper. He scrawled furiously, filling each page with numbers and arrows. He wrote equations the way others prayed. He whispered to himself the way others sang hymns. If the rocket has 4 engines, and the total fuel is R, then I must find X1, X2, X3, X4. But not just any values. Each must be given so that the rocket runs smooth, so that the total strain on the system is as little as possible. His hands shook. He could not stop. The more he wrote, the more he felt the pattern deepening, widening, until it was no longer about cattle or rockets at all. It was about life itself. Everything can be shared, he muttered. If shared right, it becomes enough. The chalk scraped until his fingers ached. He paused, breathless, sweat trickling down his forehead. He imagined handing this paper to the men on the radio, to the voices hidden far away. If they could see what I've written, would they understand? Would they laugh? For days afterward, James waited eagerly for every news broadcast. Each time NASA was mentioned, he leaned close, straining for details. He learned of test failures, of delays, of calculations that seemed unsolved. And each time his heart shouted silently, "I know this problem. I have lived it. I can help." But he told no one, not his brother, not his mother, not even his father. He feared their laughter, their disbelief. What did a farm boy know of rockets? What place had a poor black child in the halls of science? Yet the conviction would not leave him. Each time he walked with his buckets, he imagined them as tanks of fuel. Each step, each drop, became a rehearsal for the day he might show someone what he had found. One night, under a sky of countless stars, James lay awake on his cot. His brother breathed softly beside him. James whispered into the darkness, "If they gave me a board, I could show them. If they gave me a chance, I could help their rocket fly." The stars twinkled as if in answer, silent witnesses to his vow. James did not know when or how, but he knew this much. The problem of NASA and the problem of his buckets were one and the same. Somewhere in that truth lay his destiny. And so the boy from the farm, who once only counted drops of water on the ground, began to dream that his hands might steady a rocket's fire. For days after the broadcast, James carried the thought like a burning coal in his chest. He worked the fields, fetched the water, fed the cattle, but his mind lived elsewhere, in rocket hangars he had never seen, in rooms filled with chalkboards and men who spoke in numbers. The pattern was too clear to him now. It gnawed at him. One evening, while the sun dropped low and the cicadas droned their endless song, James took the boldest step of his young life. He sat at the rough kitchen table, a single sheet of paper before him, and a stub of pencil clutched tight in his hand. His fingers trembled. He had never written a letter longer than a thank-you note for church. But this was different. This was not a letter to a neighbor. It was a letter to NASA. He began slowly. "To the scientists and engineers working on the rockets, my name is James." He hesitated, pressing the pencil tip against the paper until it nearly tore. Should he tell them he was just a boy from a farm? Or would that make them throw the letter away? At last he wrote the truth. "I am 13 years old. I live on a small farm. My work is carrying water to cattle. But from that, I have seen a pattern that might help with your fuel problem." The words spilled from him. He drew his crooked equations, x1 plus x2 plus xn equals r. He wrote in his plain, unpolished way, "If the fuel is divided equally but carefully, each engine will get what it needs. The rocket will not stumble. You must share so the cost is the smallest." He explained it as though he were telling a story about buckets and troughs. He spoke of minimizing work, of avoiding waste, of making peace through sharing. His handwriting was clumsy, his letters uneven, but his heart beat fiercely with every line. When he finished, he read it over twice. The paper was smudged with the sweat of his palms, but to James it looked like a ticket out of silence. Here was his chance to speak across the miles, to let men in white coats know that somewhere a boy had found their answer. He folded the letter carefully, tucked it into an envelope, and scrawled NASA across the front. He did not know the exact address, only that the radio had spoken of Houston. He whispered the name as though it were holy. Houston, Texas. That night, after chores, he showed the letter to his father. The man sat at the table, weary from work, his hands rough and cracked from years in the fields. He looked at the envelope, then at his son's eager face. "What's this?" he asked. James's voice shook with excitement. "It's a letter, Pa, for NASA. They've got trouble with their rockets, with the fuel. I think I found a way to help." His father frowned. "Help? James, you're just a boy. You don't know those things." "But I do," James insisted softly. "It's the same as the water, the same pattern. If they see my letter—" His father's eyes hardened. "Enough!" He picked up the envelope. His thumb rubbed the edge. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a sigh heavy as stone, he tore it in half. James gasped. "Pa!" "You listen to me," his father said, his voice rough. "The world out there don't want to hear from boys like us. You'll only make a fool of yourself. And worse, they'll laugh at you, laugh at this family. We can't afford that. Forget it." The paper fluttered from his father's hand, torn pieces falling like pale leaves onto the floor. James stared at them, his chest tight, his throat burning. He wanted to shout, to fight for his letter, but no words came. Instead, he bent down, gathered the scraps, and held them in his fists. His father had already turned away, too tired to see the tears shining in his son's eyes. That night, James lay awake, clutching the torn pieces under his pillow. His heart ached, but the fire would not go out. If anything, it burned brighter. For in that moment, he understood something deeper than before. No one would send his voice for him. If his ideas were to leave this farm, he must carry them himself. In the silence of the dark, James whispered a vow. "If they won't let my letter go, then I will go. Somehow, I will stand where they can hear me." The stars wheeled overhead, vast and indifferent, but James felt them listening. His dream had been torn apart like paper, yet its pieces were now inside him, sharper and more enduring than ever. And so the boy who once counted water drops began to dream not only of rockets, but of the journey he would take, the secret path that would carry him far from his father's table, to the very gates of NASA itself. The farm was quiet before dawn, a stillness broken only by the lowing of cattle and the creak of the barn in the cool air. James rose from his cot with his heart pounding. Today, he had made his decision. If his letter could not go, then he would go himself. He dressed in his plainest clothes, an old shirt, patched at the elbows, and trousers too short for his growing legs. He slipped his notebook under his arm, the one filled with numbers, arrows, and drawings that only he could read. It was all he had, all he could offer. He moved silently through the house. His father slept heavy after a long day's labor. His mother murmured in her dreams. James paused at the door, looking back once, as though he were leaving behind not just a house, but a whole life. Then he stepped outside into the cool morning. The bus station in town was little more than a bench beside a gas station. James had never been on a bus before. He had only seen them from a distance, dusty machines groaning down the highway, carrying strangers to places he had never known. But today, he would be one of those strangers. He clutched the few coins he had saved from odd jobs, helping neighbors, carrying feed, running errands. It was not much, but it was enough for a ticket. "Where are you headed, son?" the driver asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. James lifted his chin, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "Houston." The driver raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Climb on." The bus smelled of oil and worn leather. James slid into a seat near the back, his notebook pressed tight against his chest. As the engine rumbled and the fields rolled past the window, he felt both fear and exhilaration. He was leaving the boundaries of his world, the dirt roads, the farm fences, the oak tree under which his father rested. These were vanishing behind him. Ahead lay something vast and unknown. Hours passed. The bus carried him through small towns, past fields and rivers, into a landscape that grew steadily busier, louder, more alive. James's eyes widened at the sight of buildings taller than any barn, of lights strung across streets, of people hurrying with purpose. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A cluster of structures rising from the flat land, gleaming white under the Texas sun. Signs along the road pointed the way. NASA. James's heart surged. He pressed his face to the window, his breath fogging the glass. The place he had dreamed of, the name he had whispered like a prayer, stood now before him. The bus let him off near the entrance. There was no grand welcome, only a chain-link fence topped with wire, guards at the gate, and the low hum of activity beyond. Scientists and engineers walked briskly in and out, carrying papers, speaking in clipped voices. James stood there, small and out of place, clutching his notebook. The fence loomed high, cold and unyielding. For the first time, doubt swept over him. What was he doing here? A farm boy with dusty shoes and patched clothes? What right had he to stand at the gates of the nation's most advanced institution? But then he remembered the torn letter, the pieces crumpled in his hands. He remembered the vow he had whispered in the dark. He had not come this far to turn back. He walked closer, his fingers tightening on the notebook until his knuckles whitened. The guards glanced at him, then looked away, uninterested. To them he was just another curious child staring through the fence. Yet James did not move. He stood there for a long time, his eyes fixed on the buildings beyond. The glass windows glowed in the afternoon sun. He imagined the rooms inside, the chalkboards filled with equations, the men gathered in urgent discussion. He imagined himself among them, standing small but unafraid, showing them his numbers, proving his pattern. At last, he took a step toward the gate. His voice wavered as he spoke to the nearest guard. "Sir, I have something important. For NASA." The guard frowned, puzzled. "Where's your family, kid? You can't be here alone." James lifted his notebook. I have a solution. For the rockets. For the fuel." The guard sighed, shaking his head. "Not today, son. Go on home." But James did not move. His heart hammered, his palms slick with sweat, yet he stood his ground. "Please," he whispered, "just let someone see this." The guard exchanged a look with his partner. Their voices dropped low, serious. To them, a boy loitering at the gate with a notebook could mean trouble. They stepped forward, one hand reaching for his shoulder. Fear surged through James. He clutched the notebook tighter, his entire world bound within its pages. The thought of it being taken, of being turned away, filled him with dread. "Wait," he begged, his voice cracking. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just have an idea." But the guards were already leading him toward a small building by the gate. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of metal. James was placed in a chair, his notebook still in his lap. The guards spoke into radios, their tones clipped. James sat trembling, his mind racing. He had dreamed of NASA for months, imagined walking its halls, imagined applause. Now he sat in a gray room, the hum of fluorescent lights above him, feeling more like a criminal than a dreamer. Yet even then, as his fear pressed heavy, James held his notebook close. For he knew that somewhere within those scribbles lay the truth he had carried from the fields, the pattern that could save rockets, the pattern born from water drops. And though he could not see it yet, destiny was waiting just beyond that door. The room was small, square, and gray. Its walls hummed faintly with the vibration of air conditioning, a sound foreign to James after years of silence on the farm. A single fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting a pale glow that made the shadows seem sharper. James sat on a hard chair, his notebook pressed tight against his chest as though it were armor. Across the room, a guard leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his eyes watchful. Another spoke into a radio, his words clipped and low. James's throat was dry. He had dreamed of this place, but not like this. In his imagination, the men of NASA had welcomed him, curious and kind. They had bent down to see his chalk marks, had asked him to explain. But here, now, he was a suspect. A boy with no invitation, no explanation that sounded believable. The door opened. A man in a plain suit stepped in, holding a clipboard. His voice was brisk, businesslike. "What's your name, son?" "James," he whispered. "And what are you doing here, James?" He hesitated, his voice trembling. I came to show something. Something important. For NASA." The man raised an eyebrow. "Important, huh? And what would that be?" James held out the notebook, his small hands shaking. "It's in here. A pattern. A way to divide fuel, like water, so nothing is wasted." The man sighed, unimpressed. He took the notebook, flipped through its pages. His eyes skimmed the numbers, the crooked symbols, the arrows that made sense only to James. He frowned, then closed it with a snap. "Just doodles," he muttered. "Kid stuff." James's heart sank. "No," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "Please. It's real. It works. I swear it works." The man shook his head. "You can't be here, James. You're trespassing. Do you understand?" We take security very seriously. This isn't a place for children to wander in with notebooks. Tears burned behind James's eyes, but he bit them back. He had not come this far to cry. He straightened his shoulders, as much as his small frame allowed. "I'm not here to cause trouble, I just want to help. The radio said you had a problem. I know how to fix it." For a moment, silence filled the room. The guard shifted, uncomfortable. The man with the clipboard tapped his pen against the paper. James's words were too earnest, too raw to dismiss entirely. Finally, the man sighed. "We'll call someone from inside. They'll take a look. But don't get your hopes up." He nodded to the guard who left with the notebook in hand. James sat frozen, his chest tight. He had never felt so small. Each second stretched long, his heart beat loud in his ears. He pictured his father's face, stern and weary, tearing the letter. He was right, James thought bitterly. They'll laugh. They'll send me home. But deep inside, beneath the fear and doubt, the fire still smoldered. He whispered to himself, so softly no one else could hear. "It's real. I know it's real." Minutes passed. Then the door opened again. This time it was not a guard, but a young man in a wrinkled shirt and loosened tie. He carried James's notebook under his arm. His expression was different, not dismissive, but curious. "You're the boy who brought this?" he asked. James nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." The man pulled up a chair across from him. He opened the notebook and tapped a page with his finger. "Where did you get this idea?" James swallowed hard. "From the farm. From carrying water. The drops fall in a pattern. If you share them right, nothing's wasted. I thought maybe it's the same for rockets." The young man studied him for a long moment. Then he looked back at the notebook, flipping through page after page, his brow furrowed, his lips moving as he read. At last, he let out a slow breath. This isn't nothing," he murmured. James's heart leapt. The man looked up, eyes sharper now. "Stay here. Don't move. I need to show this to someone." And just like that, he was gone, notebook in hand. James sat trembling. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Hope and fear wrestled within him, each breath a battle. He could be thrown out at any moment, or he could be heard, truly heard. The guards shifted uneasily, muttering to each other. James ignored them. He closed his eyes and pictured the chalk on his barn wall, the steady drops of water falling. the cattle drinking in peace. He remembered the vow he had made under the stars, that one day someone would see. Now, perhaps, that day had come. The young man returned sooner than James expected. His tie hung loose, his hair slightly unkempt, as though he had been running. In his hand was the notebook, James's notebook, clutched tightly, not carelessly this time, but with a kind of urgency. He pulled a chair close, sitting across from James. His eyes no longer carried doubt. They carried fire. "My name's David," he said quietly. "I'm an engineer here. Where did you learn to write these equations?" James hesitated. "I didn't learn them. Not from school. I saw them. From water. Carrying buckets to cattle. The drops, they fall in order. If I share right, none goes to waste. I wrote it down. Then the radio said, rockets had the same problem." David leaned back, astonished. His gaze moved again over the rough pencil marks, the crooked lines, the clumsy symbols. They were not written in the language of polished textbooks, but the heart of the problem, the very heart of it, was here. Resource allocation. Constraint satisfaction. Minimization. Words James had never heard, yet concepts he had lived. David remembered his own childhood. He had grown up in a mining town, the son of a coal worker. He, too, had once sat at a kitchen table with numbers no one else understood, dreaming of worlds beyond. He had been lucky, scholarships, mentors, doors that opened at the right time. But this boy before him had none of those. Only buckets of water and brilliance burning inside. "Do you know what this is, James?" David asked softly. James shook his head. "It's optimization. It's how we solve the hardest problems. And you found it on your own." James's eyes widened. "Does it work? For rockets?" David's lips curved into a smile, half disbelief, half admiration. "It just might." The guards shifted, confused by the sudden change in tone. The man with the clipboard frowned, muttering about protocols and trespassing. But David stood, his voice firm. "I'll take responsibility. Let me bring him inside." "Inside?" the guard scoffed. "He's just a kid." David's eyes narrowed. A kid who might have solved what a room full of us couldn't. There was a pause, heavy with tension. Finally, the clipboard man relented. "Fine. But if this goes wrong, it's on you." David nodded, then turned to James. "Come with me." James rose slowly, his notebook still in David's hand. His legs trembled, but he walked. Through the security door, into corridors bright with white light and echoing footsteps. His heart pounded at every sight, scientists striding with papers, engineers clustered around diagrams, the hum of machines behind closed doors. This was NASA, the place he had whispered about in the dark. And now he walked its halls. David led him into a small office cluttered with papers and books. On the desk lay blueprints of rockets, sheets covered with equations far more complicated than anything James had seen. Yet when his eyes scanned them, he recognized the same bones, the same struggle. Too much here, too little there. Never quite balanced. David laid the notebook down carefully, as though it were a fragile treasure. "I showed this to one of my colleagues," he said. "He laughed at first. Then he read closer. Now half the team is buzzing." James blinked, uncertain. "Buzzing?" David chuckled. "Talking. Excited. Wondering if this boy with a farm notebook has stumbled onto a solution." The boy's cheeks warmed. He glanced down at his patched clothes, his dusty shoes. He did not look like someone who belonged in such a place, but David's eyes shone with a conviction that steadied him. Listen, James, David said, lowering his voice. They won't accept it just because it's written in here. They need to see you do it, on a board, step by step. Can you do that? James hesitated. His hands tightened into fists. The barn wall flashed in his mind, the chalk dust on his fingers, the quiet hours spent whispering to the dark. Could he? Yes, he said softly. Then louder, stronger. Yes, I can. David smiled. Good. Because tomorrow morning, I'm bringing you to the conference room. You'll stand before men twice your age, with years of schooling, and you'll show them how a boy from the fields saw what they missed. James's chest tightened. Fear and awe mingled like storm clouds. Tomorrow. A board, not a barn wall. Scientists, not cattle. But the pattern was the same. The truth was the same. As David walked him back to the small holding room for the night, James whispered under his breath, drops of water, engines of fire, the same law. And for the first time since leaving the farm, he felt something greater than fear. He felt belonging. The next morning dawned clear and sharp. James woke in a borrowed cot, the hum of fluorescent lights above him, the sounds of footsteps echoing through the hallways outside. This was not his farm. There were no cattle lowing, no buckets waiting by the well. Instead, there were men in pressed shirts carrying folders thick with numbers, women with badges walking briskly from office to office, voices speaking in the clipped rhythm of urgency. David entered, carrying a cup of coffee in one hand and James's notebook in the other. He smiled faintly. It's time. James rose, his palms damp. He smoothed the wrinkles of his shirt, though nothing could hide how out of place he looked. A boy in patched trousers, standing among professionals who spent their lives with rockets. But when he touched the edge of his notebook, the fire returned. He had come too far to turn back now. The conference room was larger than he expected. A long whiteboard stretched across one wall. Around the table sat engineers and scientists, their expressions skeptical, some curious, some weary. Papers rustled, pens tapped against notebooks. James felt every eye on him. David spoke first. This is James. He has something to show you. I ask that you give him your attention. A murmur rose. One man scoffed openly. He's just a boy. Another frowned. We don't have time for games. But David's voice cut firm. Last night I studied his work. There's something here. Let him show you. Then judge. Reluctantly, the room quieted. David handed James a marker. James stared at it. It was not chalk, not the stub he had used on the barn wall. The smooth plastic felt strange in his hand. For a heartbeat, he froze, his throat tight. Then he remembered the sound of water drops, steady and sure. Plop, plop, plop. The rhythm filled him with courage. He stepped to the board. His first lines were shaky. X1 plus X2 plus Xn equals R. He paused, hearing someone chuckle behind him. But he drew again, firmer now, explaining in his quiet voice, This is the total fuel, R. Each engine needs its share, X1, X2, and so on. If you give too much to one and too little to another, the rocket fails. But if you share it right... He drew arrows, small boxes, the shapes he had once traced in dust. His words were plain, the language of a farm boy. Think of buckets. If one spills, the others go thirsty. Balance means peace. Balance means safety. The engineers leaned forward despite themselves. The simplicity struck them. Beneath the clumsy drawings was a truth they all knew too well: resource allocation. James pressed on. But it's not just about sharing equally. Sometimes one cow is stronger, one engine hungrier. You must give in a way that keeps the whole together while carrying the least burden. He wrote again, slower, carefully. Find x1, x2, xn so that the total is r, and the cost is the smallest. He underlined the word smallest, then looked back at them, eyes shining. That is the pattern. From water to rockets. It is the same. Silence followed. One older engineer leaned back, arms crossed. He's describing optimization, linear programming. But how does he... He broke off, staring at the board. He doesn't even know the words. Another whispered, he's built the model himself. From nothing. James felt their stares but did not shrink. He pointed to his equations, voice steadier now. This is why the engines stumble. Too much fuel here, too little there. If you share by this rule, you won't waste, and the rocket will rise. For a long moment, the room was utterly still. Then David stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. He is right. Look at it. He has taken the essence of our problem and made it simple enough to live on a barn wall. We've been blinded by our own complexity. But he saw it in drops of water. One by one, heads nodded. Some reluctantly, some with dawning respect. The scoffing man shifted uncomfortably, no longer laughing. James lowered the marker, his hands trembling. He had said all he could. He stood small before them, a boy in worn clothes, waiting for judgment. At last, the oldest man at the table, his hair silver, his eyes sharp, spoke. Young man, you have shown us something important, something true. You've reminded us that wisdom can rise from any soil, even the poorest. James's chest swelled. For the first time, he felt not like an intruder, but like someone who belonged. The room erupted in quiet murmurs, questions spilling toward David, toward one another. But James heard only the pounding of his heart, the echo of his vow, that one day someone would see. And now, they had. The murmurs in the conference room swelled until they became a low tide of voices. Astonishment, doubt, admiration, all tangled together. Papers shuffled, pens tapped against tables, and men who had spent their lives studying mathematics leaned forward to study the crude symbols a farm boy had written on their board. James stood silent, his back against the white surface, marker dangling at his side. His chest rose and fell with quick breaths. He felt as if he had been emptied, as if every ounce of courage had been poured into those numbers. Then the door at the far end of the room opened, the voices stilled, chairs scraped as men turned their heads. A figure entered, tall, broad-shouldered, his hair silver at the temples. His presence commanded the room without effort. This was the director of the center, the man whose signature decided which missions lived and which died. He glanced at the board, then at James. His gaze lingered, steady but not unkind. David stepped forward quickly. Sir, this is the boy I told you about. His name is James. The director raised a hand, silencing him. He walked closer, his shoes echoing against the polished floor. He stopped before James, lowering his head slightly so that his eyes met the boy's at level. You wrote this? He asked, his voice low and measured. James swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Where did you learn it? Nowhere, James admitted. I saw it, carrying water. The drops fall in order. If I share them right, none goes to waste. I thought, maybe rockets are the same. The director studied him. Around them, the engineers held their breath. Finally, the man's stern features softened. He extended a hand. James, we owe you thanks. Your pattern is not nonsense, it is clarity. And clarity is what we need most. James blinked, stunned. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out his small hand and placed it in the director's. The man's grip was firm, respectful, as though he were shaking hands not with a child but with a peer. "You have given us a gift," the director continued, "and more than that, you have reminded us that knowledge is not the property of the few. It can rise from anywhere, even from the fields." James's throat tightened. No words came, only the warmth of the man's hand, the truth of being seen at last. The director turned to the room. "Gentlemen, this boy has shown us what we could not see. Let us not forget it. Let us not forget him." The engineers nodded, some solemn, some still astonished. One even rose and began to clap softly. The sound spread, uncertain at first, then stronger, until the whole room was filled with the rhythm of applause. James stood in the center, his cheeks flushed, his eyes damp. He had come with nothing but a notebook and a vow whispered under the stars. Now, men of science, men he had once imagined as unreachable giants, clapped for him. When the applause faded, the director bent once more to James's level. His voice softened, almost tender. "James, I would like to invite you back. Not as a trespasser, but as a guest. You belong here more than you know." James's lips parted, but his voice failed. At last he managed a whisper. "Thank you, sir." The director smiled faintly. "No, James. Thank you." As the meeting ended and the men filed out, David placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. "I knew they'd see." James looked up at him, eyes shining. "They listened. They really listened." David nodded. "And they'll keep listening. You've opened a door that won't close again." For the rest of the day, James wandered the halls of NASA as a guest, not a suspect. Scientists greeted him with nods, some with smiles. A few even asked questions about his ideas, their voices carrying a trace of respect. He answered as best he could, always returning to the simple truth. Drops of water, shared without waste. The law of balance. The pattern that bound cattle to rockets, poverty to possibility. When evening came and James sat once more in the quiet of a borrowed room, he opened his notebook. Its pages, smudged and wrinkled, seemed different now. Not childish scribbles, but the seed of something greater. He thought of his father, tearing the letter. He thought of the vow he had made in the dark. He thought of the director's hand, warm and firm around his own. For the first time, James allowed himself to believe. I belong. I have something to give. And so, the boy who had once stood trembling outside the chain-link fence now stood on the threshold of a new world, not with fear, but with invitation. Weeks later, the invitation arrived. A letter, embossed with the seal of NASA, addressed to James by name. It asked him to stand at a conference where engineers and scientists from across the country would gather, to share in his own words the pattern he had discovered. James held the letter in his hands, the paper trembling with his breath. For so long, he had dreamed of being heard. Now the moment had come, and fear returned. He was still only a boy, still the son of a weary farmer. What could he possibly say to men who carried the weight of rockets on their shoulders? But then he remembered the torn pieces of his first letter, the vow whispered under the stars, the moment on the whiteboard when silence had turned into applause. He knew what he must do. The day of the conference arrived. The hall was vast, its ceiling arched high, rows upon rows of seats filled with men in dark suits, women with clipboards, faces intent and serious. The hum of voices echoed like a distant storm. Cameras flashed. The great seal of NASA hung above the stage. Backstage, James smoothed his shirt, his palms damp. David crouched beside him, speaking softly. "Remember, James, you don't have to be anyone else. Just tell them what you saw. Drops of water, engines of fire, the same truth." James nodded, clutching his notebook. Then the announcer's voice rang out, "Please welcome James." The applause rose, polite at first, then stronger as the boy stepped onto the stage. His small figure seemed almost swallowed by the vastness of the hall. He walked slowly to the podium, his heart pounding, the lights hot on his face. In the front row, he saw them, his parents. His mother sat stiff, her eyes shining with both pride and disbelief. His father, hat in his lap, clutched the brim so tightly his knuckles whitened. For the first time in his life, James saw tears glimmer in the old man's eyes. James drew a long breath. His voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "I am not a scientist. I am not an engineer. I am just a boy who carries water on a farm." The hall grew still. But carrying water taught me something. Each drop falls in order, like numbers. And when you share the water, if you share it right, none is wasted. Every cow drinks. No bucket spills. That is the pattern. And when I heard on the radio that rockets were failing because fuel was not shared right, I knew. The same pattern that feeds cattle can lift a rocket. He opened his notebook, its pages worn and smudged, and held it up. "This is all I had. Not textbooks, not training. Just this, and the belief that every drop matters." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. Water, fuel, opportunity. They are all the same. If we divide them with wisdom, there will be enough for all, enough for rockets, enough for people, enough for every one of us. His words fell into silence, a silence deeper than any he had known. Then slowly the audience rose. Applause thundered, echoing through the hall, rolling over him like a wave. James stood frozen, his chest rising and falling, the sound of their clapping filling his ears. He turned his head and saw his father on his feet, hat clutched against his chest, his eyes wet, his face open with pride and awe. Their gazes met, and in that moment, no words were needed. The applause did not fade. It grew, rising like a hymn, like rain falling on the roof of a poor farmhouse. And James, the boy who once traced numbers on a barn wall, stood tall upon the stage of NASA, his voice carried not by chalk or scraps of paper, but by the hearts of those who listened. In that moment, the wound of poverty and disbelief healed. Father and son, farm and rocket, drops of water and fire from the sky, all bound by a single truth: when shared rightly, it is enough. James closed his notebook gently, a quiet smile on his face. The boy who had once been turned away at the gate now stood, welcomed in the halls of power, not as a trespasser, not as a dreamer, but as a bearer of knowledge. And so the story came full circle, not ending, but beginning. For James knew that when the applause faded, when the conference was over, his true work awaited him: to return, to give, to share what he had learned with those who still carried buckets in silence. The stage lights dimmed, but the fire in James's heart only grew brighter. Thank you for listening to the story of James, a poor farm boy who once carried nothing more than buckets of water, yet left his mark in the most unexpected of places: NASA. If this story touched your heart, then perhaps the most important lesson is not about mathematics or rockets, but about belief, that in every drop of water, in every humble step, there may lie a great wisdom. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.